Welcome to this Tiedekulma Live Wednesday discussion. Today we talk about Africa. Is it finally Africa's time to flourish? What are the key factors of development on the continent, so close to us in so many ways? I'm Janne Hopsu, hosting this next hour. Interest in Africa is growing from the US to China and of course here in the European Union. Commission in Brussels published its basis for a new strategy with Africa last March, and Finland is working on its own plan. And University of Helsinki launched its brand new Africa program today. So why is Africa a hot topic again? To find out, we have here on the stage discussing Johanna Sumuvuori, State Secretary to the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Pekka Haavisto, Elina Oinas, Professor of Sociology, Gutu Vaesa, Researcher, and Maria Brockhaus, Professor of International Forest Policy, U3 here in the University of Helsinki. We also have one video contribution from Brussels EU Commissioner for International Partnerships, Jutta Urpilainen, who also drew up the EU's Africa strategy. So, Africa is now on politicians and business people's lips. Why? And what Africa are we talking about? Is it too big culturally, politically, geographically, economically to lump together under one concept or catchword? Let's start, Johanna.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to discuss with experts on this topic. I think what we are trying to do in Finland is to update our approach to African continent, and I underline the word continent. We're talking about a very diverse continent, and sometimes even how we speak about Africa sounds like we're talking about a country, but we're not. And of course, Finland has a long tradition in doing development cooperation in many African countries, and we have excellent relations and good also outcomes of that work. But what we are trying to do with the new Africa strategy, we're trying to update our political and economic relations. And what it means is that so far I think we have had a certain kind of lens we have looked at the African continent, and it has been of course very much the development co-work oriented, and maybe also there's a lot of news we are reading every day. There has been a lot of discussions about certain crises or conflicts, but Africa is a very diverse continent, and there's a great economic development going on at the moment. And at the same time, we are facing many global threats globally where we need like-minded partners. So we are trying to create more or better political relations and find shared interests with our African partners, be it countries or African Union. And we try to do it in terms of finding also like-minded countries to advance certain priorities, such as human rights, equality, or rule-based international order. And there are certain countries where we have had good cooperation and discussion on those topics. And of course, Africa has a lot of weight on multilateral fora. There's a lot of countries, and they actually form approximately a quarter of the UN members. So I think we need that kind of cooperation politically. But of course, it also opens up possibilities where we have probably shared interests and mutual interests, be it trade or we have to find common solutions to tackle or mitigate climate change. So I think that kind of reasons are very good.
There's quite many points, and we get to those in later on in talks. No problem. Elina.
Well, my first instinct when I heard about this panel and also the University of Helsinki Africa program is that, well, that's so cliche, the Africa is a country approach. But in some ways, I think this is really, really timely. And I must say the way I've heard Minister Haavisto speak about this is really needed. So in a way, if we think about Africa strategy, our university's Africa program, it's needed to shift our attention into a different gear. So there is this entity Africa that we imagine and that we actually know very little about. And it's there are like stereotypical notions about Africa that really need to change, and there's an urgent need for that. So in that sense, there is an Africa that we need to speak about, but it's our perception of Africa. And there's also a wonderful opportunity now to do something differently and do something else. I still would like to hear about the content of what the government plans to do, because it's not enough to promise a different attitude, because the disappointment will be harsh. There's a huge generation of young Africans who expect the EU, and maybe not so much from Finland, but the northern countries to start taking them seriously with respect. And if that doesn't happen again after these promises of partnership, that could be detrimental to our relations. So, but it's an interesting moment, I think.
Hopefully we get to hear about that later on in this discussion. Gutu, what do you think?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this event. Let me start by saying growing interest in Africa actually is not entirely or exclusively about Africa. It is obvious. It actually is about issues that are emerging also beyond the borders of Africa. Whenever I do comment, I would raise certain questions and would probably question certain assumptions, because partnership of any kind based or embedded in unquestioning attitude and taken for granted assumptions, which are not necessarily true, would somehow give us some sense of easy start, but definitely false start. So for that reason, I now and then ask, this Africa with which we are going to partner, is it a single big entity? Okay, no, it is diverse. But what are the manifestations of this diversity? And how do they show up in our engagement with Africa? How do we tackle about those specific diversities in specific regions in Africa? And talking about opportunities emerging, talking about challenges coming up, how do we engage with those opportunities where they are located? Africa is rising. Where is it rising? Is it falling apart in parts of Africa? Or those kinds of questions need to be raised as we go forward. I would raise some other issues. Thank you.
Good. And Maria?
There's very little to add actually here, because the key issues came already up, and that is right from the start, we are not talking about one Africa here. And I guess the reason why we sit here together, talking to you outside here, this room, is I guess also to push forward more thinking about the notions, the different diversity, and the many expectations that come with such challenges and strategies. And I really believe that if we don't challenge and bring out our own assumptions, the assumptions that drive politicians in these issues, we really miss yet again another opportunity to really collaborate, to really engage in partnerships. So just also thank you for having us here, having me here, and allowing us to talk about this.
Thank you. And now let's hear the Commissioner Urpilainen's video comment on Brussels' aim on relations between Africa and the EU.
Dear friends and colleagues, my thanks to the University of Helsinki and the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now really is the right time to discuss Africa. Over the past 6 months, the pandemic has changed a lot. We have lost loved ones. We have experienced serious threat to our health and jobs as well. Today we are still battling a pandemic, but we must also raise our attention to the better, more sustainable and equal post-COVID world. A crucial partnership to build back better will be with our closest neighbour, twin continent and natural partner, Africa. In March, we adopted our new strategy with Africa. Now Finland is preparing its own strategy. Working together with our partners, our objective is to build a forward-looking, long-term partnership of equals. A partnership of equals that puts the next generation first. The new strategy is built on joint opportunities like the green and sustainable economy, digitalization, education and skills. Together, Africa and Europe can build low-carbon, resource-efficient and climate-resilient future. Together we can boost Africa's digital transformation to make sure everyone in the continent gets connected. Together we can ramp up sustainable investment, promote a stronger investment climate and increase intra-African trade. Together we can help Africa's youth fulfill their potential with education, training and skills. To do this, we will work with you. Dear friends, we want to support our partners' transition to knowledge-based and innovation-led economies. We want to join them in their green and digital transformations. In this regard, we are putting our money where our mouth is, with Africa by far being one of the biggest recipients. European higher education institutions have been instrumental partners in our research cooperation initiatives. We are building on the experience of the Bologna process to promote the culture of quality assurance and accreditation in Africa. Initiatives like Africa Connect, the African Union Research Grants, the Intra-Africa Academic Mobility Scheme, as well as the Erasmus+, just to mention few. To really build back better, we must continue to step up our efforts in research and innovation in partner countries. Only together, in cooperation and through partnerships, we will create global and sustainable recovery. And in this vital work, I count on the support of Finland and the University of Helsinki. Thank you for your attention.
So many optimist words. What is your view on her presentation? Let's start, Kutu, from you.
Yes, in this 3 minute something presentation, I think she covered a lot of issues of grand concepts. One that attracted my attention would be, for example, the ambition to look forward to a more equal world post-COVID. Again, while thinking about that, I actually thought, what would it mean to aspire for such a world? Then I started to think, in fact, what comes after COVID-19 is partly what is being done while we are here within the context of dealing with post-COVID. And I was thinking about elections in different countries, and as I think about the election, postponement of election in Ethiopia itself, then what would it mean to use COVID as a genuine reason to do something better, but at the same time, possibility of opening it up for abuses and using it as a pretext for all kinds of undemocratic procedures. So those are the issues that came to mind. Again, while thinking about knowledge-based, innovation-led economy, I also thought about how is this going to be realized in countries in Africa where, in fact, schools are being used as prisons because the normal prisons are full. That is what is happening in Ethiopia, and I can reflect on that more broadly as we proceed. Thank you.
Okay, Elina.
Well, it's a nice speech, and I also, it made me yesterday read carefully the EU Africa strategy, and I think it's very good to be positive about everything she says and everything that is in the text, but maybe it could be more important to talk about the missing issues, like what is not said and what is not on the in the strategy and on the agenda. It's like there's a lot of good things like equality. She really emphasized that, even calling it twin continents, which is a nice idea, but I wonder how many on the African continent feel that they are treated like twins. So that, for example, that is an issue that is never raised by the high levels, like how do we deal with racism, really, a word that is really taboo also in Finland to discuss, and especially on like in a middle class context where it's not placed somewhere else. The fact that there is a lot of EU skepticism and kind of pessimism about how genuine gestures are is actually also seen in the document. There's hardly anything about what EU should do differently in order to not create problems in Africa. So all the good efforts are there counted as something that needs to be done in Africa. So there's a lot of interesting plans on digitalization and education, and nothing wrong with that. But how about those that if it's a strategy, it should be both sides trying to do things differently? And that's what I'm still waiting for, how that. And I think that is something Finland could push, some kind of brutal honesty about problems, rather than just nice phrases that become then quite problematic if they end up being superficial.
Maria, do you agree?
Yes, I do agree very much. And I think I also agree with what Gutu said earlier. There are so many, maybe I'm going a bit ahead with our program now, but there are also so many false solutions. And that again is where I think policy needs independent, credible science to inform and to flag these issues, to bring them out and to really raise attention to those very uncomfortable topics such as racism, such as closed borders here. Just to give one example, I tried in these COVID times, I had hired a couple of new PhD students for a project which has the ironic title of Tackling Inequalities. It's about the forest sector. Is that perhaps an inequality machine we are asking for in the Congo Basin, looking at colonial legacies, etc. And I'm bringing this up because it's exactly one of those inequalities then we stumble over. In COVID, the first thing that was closed are embassies. Maybe I should talk to the foreign ministry here as well. And that means these colleagues with contracts from sub-Saharan Africa cannot come because they don't get a visa, which means their contracts don't become effective. So these are issues that we really have to tackle here as a country, as a European Union, and the Europeans we want to be, but also here within the university in collaboration, for example. And I know that I'm going a bit far here, but this identification of false solutions is of course very important because I mentioned inequality here, and that is something that I liked with the speech by that we heard, and that is, and also actually already at the beginning, there is I think there is a lot of awareness for the underlying causes of inequality and how important it is to bring that out. But still, as you also pointed out, these assumptions are not really out there. And as we heard from you, I think the mechanisms how to realize that, how to go beyond awareness and acknowledging are not yet clear. And I think they also didn't come out in a 3-minute speech, which is perhaps no surprise. But we would expect more from the documents, from the strategic plans that Finland and the European Union is working on. So.
Critical points of view, how is seen from ministry's perspective?
Yeah, thank you very much for your views. I really appreciate it. And I think, like, if I'm addressing a bit what Commissioner Urpilainen just said, I think we are in a good place as Finland when it comes to the themes that the EU is trying now to tackle. And Commissioner Urpilainen mentioned EU's interest in green economic transition and educational skills and digitalization and youth, and those are very much in line as themes with what we are looking at now within the strategy. And when you in your first on the first round you mentioned what are the contents. Actually, we don't have all the contents yet because the process is very consultative. So we have now had public hearings one public hearing, and then we have thematic hearings for different stakeholders. So we are not doing this only as a foreign ministry or even only as a government. We are doing this together with our different stakeholders. Of course, stakeholders from Finland, universities can be identified as one, research communities, private sector, and NGOs. And of course, when we are also discussing this, we are discussing with our African partners in embassies. We are consulting, of course, discussing with our African partners in the countries where we have embassies, but also organizing hearings. And diaspora in Finland is also one of the target groups we are having discussions with. So we think that it's not only the government which is now outlining this, or not only the EU, but we need societies as whole to be thinking from different sectors' perspectives how to actually develop the cooperation. And when I mentioned about the contents, I can't tell yet what are going to be in the final document, but our aim is to have very kind of tight focus. We are not that big of a country that we could have cover everything and with limited resources. So we are trying to look at which sectors, which themes we have something to offer, which we can find those shared interests with our African partners as well. And so far, the thematic working groups, we have been working on those things to kind of generate the discussions, have been on themes like peace and security, education and skills, trade and economy, and climate, environment, and natural resources. And we need common solutions. And so even this discussion here is, I see it as part of the process, to be honest.
Now I have to ask, when is the Africa strategy ready, when it's published? I have to ask at this point.
The process is now underway, so we have had those, actually the thematic hearings are now underway, and we aim at getting it ready till the end of the year, if not the latest at the early spring next year. But of course I have a chairperson role in the steering group, so I try to keep the process as very tight and focused. And I think there has been a lot of good impulses from different sectors. Like I know that Helsinki University has now its own Africa program, which is a great example of a kind of thinking that generates also things that build on the things that we are trying to do at the ministry. And on private sector side, there has been also different kind of reports as to how the markets are actually, what kind of possibilities there are on the African markets.
So it's coming later on this year, by the end of the year?
The national process, I hope so, yes.
Okay, good. Then there's a report by the Finnish Foreign Ministry which is listing 6 major megatrends concerning Africa. Population growth, climate change, urbanization, migration, technology, and democracy. Let's keep these in mind when we move on a bit more to the next part, which is asking why Europe, China, and other international players are reaching and competing in Africa, and at what price for African societies is equal partnership possible? This we will talk about next. So discussing Africa here in Tiedekulma are Johanna Sumuvuori, State Secretary to Ministry for Foreign Affairs Pekka Haavisto, Elina Oinas, Professor of Sociology, researcher Kutu Vajessa, and Maria Brockhaus, Professor of International Forest Policy, all you three here in the University of Helsinki. What this race for Africa means to Africans and African societies. I mean, for example, looking from a European perspective and our history, we have a difficult historical baggage concerning Africa. Let's start from you Maria, and you're specialized in forestry.
Yeah, thank you. Baggage, I think it's an important word that also came up in our discussion. I think you mentioned it earlier, we heard it in the earlier speech. And that is why I think, for example, in these mega trends, what is missing is an explicit acknowledgement of inequality as a major mega trend, driving, for example, also migration to some extent. And yeah, maybe that's the key point here that I would like to make. Inequality is crucial, and that then reflects also on specific sector interests. So if one of the major areas the strategy is is selected, for example, when we think about forests, I have to say I think automatically at deforestation in the tropics. I work a lot in the Congo Basin. I also work in West and South and East Africa, but currently mainly in the Congo Basin, one of the major forest biomes. And if you see the competing interests in these vast landscapes, then of course you wonder if this is a race for Africa with a level playing field of partners, or is it a competition between key actors that claim to be less bad than the other one? So that's this Chinese-European tension that we see in our research a lot in the Congo Basin. And I wonder, in this context where you have also this claims over land or these interests, I do wonder then when this is framed under climate change mitigation, and that would be I think an important debate to have that is going on here in Finland that already exists, and that is actually whose sustainability matters in these questions. How can we have in Europe, I'm from Germany, which I guess is quite obvious, but we have also, like here, much investments in a bioeconomy strategy where we try to build basically towards a clean shift away from fossil fuels, our climate change activities on biomass. But where is this biomass coming from? So if we start, and that's a big discussion here in Finland, which I really appreciate, if we have to think about spillovers, displacement of emissions, our consumption, and that's a point you actually made earlier. Much of the solutions to these problems they don't have to be done on the African continent, but these solutions, responses are here. And in this context, I have to stop soon, but we also have one of the big issues that were mentioned earlier is finance, investment. And part of our research is to follow the money. So who benefits from these so-called green revolutions somewhere else? And again, a strategic plan, strategy development. It's wonderful to have these talks because it helps to inform strategy, to see these nuances. Sustainability for who benefits, but also whose opportunities do matter when we talk about a race for Africa. So who is racing here? Are we repeating colonial pasts where Africa, the continent, was also perceived as something to race for, but not to realize equality, but for extraction in the forest sector, natural resources, extraction and exploitation? Sorry for long
that's
talks.
very good points. How about go to these megatrends, and then we think about land use regarding the agriculture. Huge areas of agricultural land are being rented by foreign companies and even by foreign states to feed their own people, not the local populations. Doesn't sound like a win-win situation for example, in Ethiopia.
Oh, interesting. This is actually my research area. I could talk more, but I should be very brief. Let me say this. Now, as we think of engagement with Africa, however crude that is, we also need to see into how state and people are related within those countries. That varies actually across states, depending on the level of democracy, whether it is actually democratizing or backsliding to authoritarianism and so on and so on. But then, how are people included in those states, in those countries, in the process of those deals, for example, as far as land is concerned? Is land being grabbed actually while pulling the people to be complicit in the process through different means, through disempowering them, or, for example, under the name of nominal consultation, where they are not heard but listened to in a meeting they are called to, and so on. So I look at the process of the land deal, how resources divided, how decisions are made about what land should be used for what purpose, and so on. At the inclusivity of the process, it is also reflected in the distributive justice implicated within the outcome of the process. So in that sense, I've done a lot of research, and And the core message I would take is, as far as Ethiopia is concerned, the land belongs to the state. Constitutionally, it says the land belongs to the state and the people, but the people are, through the process, excluded, effectively. So that means if there is any relation that involves natural resources of all kinds that comes from Europe to Africa, this kind of relationship should question the way things are handled in those countries. There is no, it should not begin with the assumption that the states do represent the interest of the people. The people are recognized, their way of life, their land use is recognized to begin with. That assumption could be false start. And then whatever we do after that would in fact is building on that hollow ground, which is very problematic. That much I would say for now.
So people are excluded. How they could be included? One of those megatrends is democracy on that foreign ministry's list, and we know that democratic states are under strain around the world, also in Africa. So how enhance democracy in Africa to get people to jump on the wagon, let's say that way?
This is extremely hard, and there's no easy solution. Democracy is a challenge everywhere, and we see it with populisms in Europe and authoritarianisms both here and there, and US and Russia. I mean, this is not easy anywhere, but of course with the history of African states, it's super difficult. We had a project on African youth activisms and social movements, and it's clear that there's a lot of distrust to the state, and for good reasons. So how to build that, and how to build something new, I would say, rather than going with the old classic theories about democracies, but maybe starting from what Gutu was saying, like really trying to grasp an attention to the people rather than only the state, and try to figure out how differences among the population might appear as opinions, as movements, and work with social movements, political activists of different sorts. And I think here the government policy seems quite promising. Try to build different alliances and not only looking at... Often we talk about states as if they were subjects and people, and we have talks with African states as if they were one. So that kind of diversity in hearing voices and really taking people seriously, and the ways they are silenced and the violence that is going on is really, really important.
Yes, some of those countries who are partners with Africa, let's say China, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, are very non-democratic, and really they say that they want to in any way interfere, which is of course interfering someone internal matters is wrong, but otherwise they just don't care about the democracy. They seems more or less interested in the raw materials they can extract.
I think that, I mean, there's been a concern about other nations coming to Africa and exploit the resources other than European. So it's been a long concern. I remember 15 years ago there was a wave of outcry about China. I mean, this is of course a problem, but we are part of the problem. So how to talk about, because I mean, I guess your original question about why Africa is so interesting right now is about the growing population, meaning markets, meaning urban youth that can do interesting stuff. So there's both the threat and the opportunity talk going on. That same goes for resources and extractivism. Can we keep on exploiting alone, or are there other players, and do they have options in who to negotiate with? But I think there's also a third trend that is really interesting, and that would be like a genuine, sincere interest in trying to build new alliances where really new solutions are sought, and working with actors in the global south is really meaningful right now with the climate change, with growing inequalities, with awareness that we must learn different tricks and we must learn different capacities and learn new politics. So there I think alliances between, for example, African academics or activists is really, really helpful for us to understand what's going on globally. So there is an opportunity for Finns to learn rather than go and teach. And that aspect I think is really valuable, and it is there. It's not something that needs to come up, but like working with those, for example, student movements on decolonizing academia, it really would be a more interesting route to go than trying to be excellent in the old terms in our science production.
Let's talk about that a little bit later on the education and academic cooperation. Johanna, you were talking about, Elina, third trend. Would Finland be part of that third trend? And as a small country, does it make any difference? We're no China or the US.
Well, there has been a lot of interesting points made here now, and I think what you said about what we do ourselves compared to what we kind of require in one way, or sustainability, or whatever the term would be. I think we have to have our own house in order when it also comes to keeping up certain values, and of course our government program is quite ambitious as to the mitigating climate change, but also things like advancing rule of law, democracy, human rights, and the rights of women and girls, for example. So I think there has to be always that kind of basic knowledge of what is our motivation, what are our kind of basic values, also when we do foreign policy. And you mentioned states. Obviously, of course, as a state, Finland has certain need for a new kind of diplomacy also, a kind of new approach in diplomacy. But state is not the only actor here, as we have been actually discussing here. So there are a lot of actors who have a lot to say to this kind of development. Civil society, you talked about people. Civil society connections are very crucial in this. Private sector, academia. So I would say that we still need traditional state-level influencing and diplomacy in many ways, and this kind of mutual interests, which we find through diplomacy. But we also need this new, what did you say, new alliances? So to advance this kind of agenda, positive, sustainable agenda, we need this thinking throughout the society. And maybe just to underline that, I think if we keep up talking about rule of law, multilateral, the meaning of multilateral system and international rule-based order, it also benefits the global discussions on political fora, how to advance this together also with our African partners. And there are African countries who are like-minded with us within those questions. So I don't see, of course I have to be positive also, I can't be just cynical as to how things are evolving. So,
do one of you want to comment on Johanna's words? Maria, yes.
I have to say this talk is brilliant because it's too many ideas at the same time. So just to pick up on this, which I find interesting, is this societal interest. Because it's always a question of whose society, again, what society we are talking about. And perhaps there's also a responsibility for, and that is what I also take away from our speech we heard earlier, is there's also a responsibility to make sure that this year is not just protecting Finnish interests or European interests of European societies or Finnish societies, but really to acknowledge that there are other societal interests as well. So to put a stop at this exploitation narrative that I keep hearing, and it's wonderful to hear this a third way or a different way, but in my realities, when I'm teaching students, when I talk with colleagues, the narratives, when I engage with the private sector in forest industry around the world, I have to say the narratives there are still the very old narratives of, oh, but these people will have jobs, and if we plant trees there, they benefit from that. And this is them and us, and what are the sizes of these benefits? So we then have a clean climate at home. They have forest tree plantations where the benefits are perhaps also made elsewhere again. this is what I'm still missing here. And I'm sad to hear always the same narratives. And these are very colonial narratives. So I wonder how to break that. We have to come up with a third way, but not in our little bubbles. And a last footnote I have to make is cleaning up their own house. I was so happy as I heard that, because I think that's the most important start, perhaps. And we can look at ourselves, look at our panel, how diverse are we? So it's something we have to pay attention to all the time. Sorry for being so passionate here.
Gutu and Elena, you want to say something before we go to the educational part? Do you want to comment?
I would say
okay,
a few
yes.
things. And talking about these values of the rule of law, that is interesting. And beyond that, actually, Johanna's mention of this engagement not with the state as an entity, but with different actors within those states. There, you mentioned about civil society. Then the question would be, how do civil societies operate? How are they allowed to operate? Are there certain legal mechanisms that the state use to exclude them? How do we get to those civil societies that are disempowered in those countries? So these questions remain also to reflect in other areas. Until recently, for example, Ethiopia had got a civil society law, which actually extremely disempowered the civil society. But the promised reform in 2018 started to make some changes in the law of the civil society. But again, the promised reform has now slided back. It actually is off track at the moment, as far as my reflection is concerned. Talking about rule of law, then, if really we take this rule of law seriously, how would it be when we see the law is used as a weapon against oppositions, against civil society, against political opponents and activists and so on? Where do we stand in that divide between dictators trying to silence people using the law, while we really claim that we uphold this rule of law as a grand principle that we follow? Those questions come to mind.
And Elena, your comment.
I'm listening. I think it's
good.
super interesting. I guess, this question of accountability is really important. Like how, say, Finnish companies doing business somewhere in ecologically harmful ways. What mechanisms are there? Like, I think we are quite. We leave our companies off the hook quite easily. It's not like we have a very active civil society in these issues.
Good. Because we have only 1 hour, let's go to the education. Education, research and technology, are these means for a better future? So when we talk about education on different levels, let's take as an example the Africa program of the University of Helsinki that was launched today. It's with the University of Nairobi to years 2021 to 2030, and it's focused on health and food security and teacher education. And when we think that the median age in Africa is 18 compared to European Union's 42 or 41, so there's a very large young population, and then we should have women also participating actively in the society. Do these, let's say, up-level academical programs help people there in their everyday lives, or are they two different worlds? Elina, let's start from you.
Well, I think higher education partnerships are really crucially important. I think we do, if we think about now Finnish taxpayers' money, investing in higher education collaboration is meaningful regarding the poorest or the most vulnerable because we are able to train the local expertise in so many different ways. So, but that training cannot be so that even the word training is actually misleading. It needs to be a genuine collaboration. But I do believe that societies benefit from academic exchange in much more general way than just benefiting those individuals that we encounter. So there definitely I am quite optimistic about this. There's a lot of emphasis on primary education, secondary education, vocational training too. But those shouldn't compete with each other. I think we need all these levels. And there is, I mean, we have so much evidence that there is a huge learning crisis globally. And one of those issues that really need to be tackled are systems, but then also contextualizing learning, like making it meaningful in the setting where it is. And I think there universities can do quite a lot, but we can't go with ready packages of learning materials. And I think that could be the mistake Finland is doing, that we don't train ourselves enough to be able to contextualize, say, teacher education to a setting in Mozambique. That must be done in careful collaboration and long-term partnerships. And that requires a lot of skills from us. And I'm not quite sure we have them yet. We need to develop much more in those regards. But it is an important task and we have a lot to offer, but we have to take it as a huge effort on our side too.
Guru, what is your point on these academic programs, for example, that was launched today by the university?
Yes, I had a brief look on some of the key elements of that program, and let me quote. It says, our ambition is to increase our global impacts and build a more sustainable world with our African partners. And then it also points out that the intention is to build mutually beneficial and equal partnerships with African partners. Now, then again, this takes me back to the obvious question of who benefits then from this program, mutually beneficial, on who is represented on the other side of the relationship, and how are they represented, is there a way, for example, if there is no fair representation, is there a way to rectify unfair rules of engagement or unfair representation, to correct them? Is there a way to use certain leverages to make corrections to when things happen to be not moving in the right direction? Equal partnership as a principle, yes, but there should be some conditions for equality as well. Is it something that we build through time, or is it that something that we assume that we are equal now? A university in Finland and a university in some African country, they start from equal level. So these are the things that come to my mind. It says we build on groundbreaking basic research, open-minded curiosity and cooperation that transcends boundaries to address the key challenges of our times, which includes climate change and so on. Then in most of the strategies that I see a kind of amplifying technical matters and downplaying political ones. And that is also reflected. Yes, there are explicit political matters that are mentioned also in EU strategy that was launched in March, but I see there is a kind of subsiding or downplaying some political issues which are too sensitive, probably for the partners on the other side. And I think until we come to terms with the reality that we are dealing with, if we are dealing with democratic states, relatively speaking, it should be different from dealing with authoritarian states. it should be different, because it will be different in practical terms as well. So that assumption need to be questioned, and all I could say is the political would also reflect in the education, how education is distributed, who is going to benefit, how is gender equality addressed through education, and all these kinds of questions come to my mind.
Maria, this technology over politics, is that a part of our colonial past that we keep it away, that just we think kind of technocratically still?
I think maybe this is an issue of post-colonial presence and also the way we approach the future. I think this projectification, rendering political problems technical, is something that we observe in everyday politics, at least in our work, in the land use sector, everywhere. If it is we don't have to travel to it would be in Southeast Asia, in Central Africa, as our research clearly shows. And it's something, it's easier to talk about numbers that give the idea that they are independent. But of course, numbers are also selected, they are interpreted. So these politics of numbers get ignored when we deal with larger data sets. I think there are so many dimensions to this rendering technical rather than focusing on the politics. It's also reflected, of course, in funding for research. What kind of research funding is available? And my impression is that because everybody in the North, I'm saying that as somebody who joined this country 4 years ago, so I take the freedom of speaking as an observer. Sometimes I think because everybody is so polite here, nobody wants to invest money in political research, in politics, because it's a bit disturbing if you bring out politics. It's so much nicer to come with a promise of technical advancements than unpacking the politics in a particular sector. It's also, I think, maybe something to consider here is that because everybody these days wants to have a solution to everything, we forget the core value of research sometimes, and that's not to provide a technical solution for a short term, but to help civil society, its politicians, which are also part here, to help people think about what is actually wrong. And I think independent, credible science becoming forced to deliver solutions is maybe a problem because it doesn't help us also to encourage our colleagues in different countries on the African continent to collaborate and to share knowledge that would advance these, or bringing out these assumptions that not only the political elite in a particular country on the African continent has, but also something that we might find in Finland or Germany at least as well.
Johanna, are we afraid of politics in education as well?
I don't know. I think the educational institutions are better experts in commenting that how does it look like from the inside. But in general, I would say when it comes to education, and also maybe in our cooperation with the African states and African partners, I think Finland is a good example as a country of benefiting from great level of education. We have not always been a prosperous country. And I think the kind of Finnish success story as it's told, it's actually based on investing in education and research. And I think we still need to be mindful of our own policies as well regarding the funding and what kind of space there is for good research and new innovations as well, because it's not like that it's in our genetics that we are just very good in education. No, it's always done by deliberate political decisions, and it has to be reinforced every day or every week. And I think that's also one of those values that I think we have to underline on a political level as well when we discuss about this kind of topics. And education and skills is one of the themes that we're looking at in this Africa strategy process. And you're talking about obviously, of course, about higher education institutions and research, and that's brilliant. And I'm actually very happy that Helsinki University has done this program, and it already has had a long-term cooperation in Kenya. But I'm also looking at, I think it's also important to look at vocational and skills training, because that's also very important to have good quality education on vocational level. And of course, primary education it's a big educational package. We can't succeed if each of those sectors are not taking into consideration when we outline new policies. And that's my take on this topic. And now you mentioned, some of you mentioned disinformation and challenges to democracy. I personally see education as one very good kind of a cure for that kind of tendencies that are challenging. We have been reading a lot about misinformation and election interference and that kind of things in recent years. Not only in certain countries, also we are all threatened by those kind of anti-democratic tendencies. And education is a very good way to try to influence in that kind of negative developments as well.
Elina, you wanted to comment on this.
Yeah.
And or I ask education and democracy. Do they go hand in hand?
I think I totally agree. It's about like skills for critical thinking, but that then also requires the space for critical thinking and kind of collective thinking in a way that challenges properly. I think that the University of Helsinki Africa program should not be read as just a way of helping or assisting African universities, but actually, and also not just an opportunity for us, but a genuine collaboration so that we actually create good science. Because without much more and better and deeper knowledge about Africa or Global South in general, we are weak as a university. We are parochial. We are narrow-minded and biased to the Global North. So we actually need this in a non-dramatic, neutral way. It's good social science to know more than only our small country. There's no.
Thank you. 1 hour is about to end. Good science. Let's have a last remarks on how to make good science then.
Invest in independent, credible thinking, critical thinking, but also credible science together. And that means we have to invest in partnerships and partnerships on eye level. I think we are all struggling to get these eye levels right because, as already pointed out, these eye levels are not really there. So I think it's working on and keep bringing out underlying assumptions, the things we struggle and stumble over in our own work, our biases that we have, our ideas how a university in Kinshasa is operating. So do we really take them serious? That's the other big thing. And of course we want, but I think it's work to work on biases. And you cannot kill biases, but you can bring them out and then deal with them.
Good. Do you agree?
I do agree. And good science actually thrives in a context of freedom, and when people are free to think, and when restrictions are not imposed on people. I don't know if I have 30 seconds, or is it absolute that we'll stop at 70?
No, it's just fine if it just doesn't take too long.
I read this sentence on the document by the EU, Africa Relations document, recognizing that all human rights are universal, invisible, and interdependent and interrelated. The EU and African countries are committed to promoting and protecting all human rights and fundamental freedoms globally. Now, I was intrigued by EU speaking for African states as committed, not as they have said they have committed, but EU and African states are committed. And this commitment, when tested in practice, is questionable. Now, my question then would be, now, these kind of statements, grand statements, need to be taken, looked at closely. If universality of human rights, what does it mean actually? Does it mean human rights violation in the corner in that village in Ethiopia? Is it equally valued as human rights violation in other countries, in European countries, for example, at least at the level of at the conceptual level. No, practice is different. So these are the issues. I had a whole issue of what is going on in my home country, in Ethiopia, very threatening situation with actually very shrinking democratic space. But for the sake of time, I cannot go to details. But again, I think you have the details and the specifics that we are really dealing with critical issues. Our position in this context would matter as much as it can. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have something to add before I leave the last word for Johanna?
Maybe for the universities to think about the students and the staff members we have from the African universities and really take them seriously. I very much appreciate the government's effort of engaging diaspora in the Africa strategy process. But with us, we really need to work hard to make people equal in this university and actually see everybody as contributing and feeling safe in this environment. And there is a huge workload to do still.
Johanna.
Thank you very much. There was a lot of food for thought for me as well. Maybe just to, I always leave this disclaimer that all these topics, for example, what we discussed today here, are not going to be in detail in the strategy. I just know it because it's going to be very focused. But and it's going to be focused on economic and political relations. But when you think of political relations, it actually covers a lot of topics when you think of the UN meetings and multilateral fora, what kind of like-minded partners we are on the lookout for. And also, when it comes to science, I think we, as decision makers, also need scientific research, also as a kind of a basis for doing wise solutions or finding wise solutions and making wise decisions. And maybe to promote a bit what we have done in Finland, this government has actually good statements as to the dialogue with the scientific community in the government program. And now, for example, when we have been trying to tackle the COVID crisis nationally, we have had expert panel, science panel, which has been advising certain decision-making processes. So I would say that we need that globally more. It's not just Finland, it's not just EU or African continent. I think we need to kind of find ways to engage scientific community and their knowledge and expertise to benefit the kind of everyday decision-making processes, because that's why I think we truly get better decisions when the scientific communities are involved. And this kind of discussion is also maybe not too formal, but a good way of having exchange on the topical questions. So thank you very much for your contributions.
Excellent. Our Africa hour is up. I'd like to thank you all here on the stage and all of you who've been watching this stream. And next week, ensi viikolla keskustellaan siitä, mikä liikuttaa kansaa Venäjällä. Venäjän arjen yhteiskunnallisesta ja poliittisesta toiminnasta ovat puhumassa apulaisprofessori Veli-Pekka Tynkkynen, dosentti Meri Kulmala ja toimittaja Jussi Konttinen. Tämän Venäjä-keskustelun juontaja on Ville Blofield. Hyvää keskiviikkoa. Have a nice Wednesday. Thank you.